This is part 3 of the week's topic, neuroanatomy, now looking at the lower order centers of the central nervous system. The distinction between higher and lower is very simple in the idea that it's referring to the location relative to your body. So the higher order centers are located in your head, whereas the lower order centers are located below the higher order centers in space. So the lower order centers comprise the spinal cord and neurons that are projecting out from the spinal cord, things like neural tracts that are within the cord and then project out through the peripheral nervous system. So just a review of the components of the spinal cord. You have two different types of tissue within the spinal cord. You have what's called gray matter as well as white matter. The reason why they're referring to the tissue based on color is that the central portion of the spinal cord has this butterfly-like shape, and it is actually gray, and the reason why it's gray is that it consists of neuron cell bodies. Whereas the white matter, which surrounds that butterfly-like shaped center, is composed of myelinated neuron axons. So it's the actual lipid content of the myelin that creates that white color and hence white matter. If we focus specifically on the gray matter itself, though, we have two different areas. We have the dorsal horn, which are located basically on your back, the back of you, whereas the ventral horn is located on the front of you, the front side of your spinal cord or spinal column. And there's two different things going on based upon whether or not we're referring to the dorsal horn or ventral horn. The dorsal horn, or the cells that are within there, the neuron cell bodies again, are transmitting sensory information to the higher order centers. In other words, information is traveling from down to up, in other words, put it simply. Whereas the ventral horns contain alpha motor neurons, and their axons are terminating in skeletal muscle, which means that information is traveling from up downwards. And we'll get into the various tracks that comprise these down-up or up-down systems. These are referred to as neural tracts. So one type of pathway, that's another way we can refer to as a neural tract, is a pathway. In this case, this is a very simple pathway. It's called the reflexive pathway. And the reason why it's simple is that there's really only one synapse. You have a sensory neuron, let's say located in the skin or perhaps in the muscle, and it synapses with a motor neuron at the level of the spinal cord. So there's not a lot happening in terms of the number of neurons that are involved. The other issue with this is that it happens very quickly. As you know, with a general reflex, they're not under voluntary control. In other words, they are considered to be involuntary responses. And the reason why they're involuntary is that they're trying to protect you. And if you had to think to move to protect yourself in some situations, it would take too long to process the information and you would end up getting hurt. So, for example, one type of reflexive pathway is the hand reflex pathway, or hand withdrawal reflex pathway, I should say. So that occurs when one touches something that's hot. When you touch something that's hot with your hand, what happens? Well, you pull your hand back very fast. You have sensory neurons that are located in your hand, and they synapse with motor neurons in the spinal cord, and those motor neurons innervate the muscles in your bicep. So once you touch that hot object, a very quick impulse is sent to the motor neurons innervating the bicep and telling it to contract. This is not under voluntary control. This is purely reflexive. And similarly, there's also motor neurons that innervate the tricep. You don't want to innervate the tricep in the sense that you want them to activate, but you want them to relax. In other words, you want them to not fire or not be activated or be inhibited so that the bicep can fully contract. So that's an example of the protective mechanism that occurs with something like the hand withdrawal reflex. One other thing about the reflexive pathway is that it's ipsilateral. And ipsilateral is referring to whether or not the pathway crosses to the other side of the body. In other words, when you have a sensory receptor that's stimulated in your right hand, the sensory nerve synapses with a motor nerve in your spinal cord on the right side of your body, and it stays on the right side of your body. And then the motor neuron innervates the bicep on the right side of your body. But we do have pathways that decussate. In other words, they cross the body, whereas this case is ipsilateral. Another characteristic of the reflexive pathway is that it's stimulus dependent. In other words, you cannot choose what the actual response will be. When you touch something hot, you pull your hand away. There's no thinking that's involved. It's predetermined, in other words, it's pre-programmed. So that brings us to tracts. Tracts are bundles of axons that relay sensory and motor information between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system being the projections of nerves and neurons from the spinal cord. Innervating muscle, innervating organs and glands, for example. So how can we make the distinction between tracts and just individual neurons? Well, it's based upon common origin and common termination sites. And typically, the name of each tract is a reflection of this. So we'll see a number of neurons that all originate in the same area of the brain, and they all terminate in a similar area. And hence, we can then refer to it as a tract and give it a specific name. Generally speaking, we have two types. We have something called descending tracts, which are motor pathways. In other words, information in the brain is sent through the spinal cord and then perhaps beyond. The other type of tract we have is an ascending tract or sensory pathway, where information is gathered in the spinal cord, most likely from peripheral nerves, and then gets sent upwards to the brain, the sensory cortex. So this descending, ascending is a reflection of the direction of movement. Information going from the brain down the spinal cord is going in a descending fashion, whereas information going from the spinal cord up to the brain is more of an ascending fashion. So we'll be looking at ascending tracts first. Again, these are our sensory tracts. We have a few types. We have something called the Spinocerebellar Tract, which again, the name is telling us that the origins are in the spine and the termination site is in the cerebrum. And essentially what's going on with this type of tract, sensory receptors, or the neurons for sensory receptors, then travel up to the sensory cortex. So within the spinocerebral tracts, we have two specific tracts that are considered spinocerebral. We have the spinothalamic, otherwise known as the anterolateral system, and we also have the posterior column pathway or tract, which is also referred to as the medial lemniscus pathway. If we talk about the posterior column medial meniscus pathway, this is transferring specific sensory receptor information regarding proprioception, touch, and pressure information. These tracts are contralateral, meaning that they cross to the opposite side of the body, and the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway decussates or crosses over in the medulla. The spinothalamic tract, or the anterolateral system, there's two parts of it. There's a lateral spinothalamic tract and an anterior spinothalamic tract. They serve to transmit pain and temperature information, and they are also contralateral, but they decussate at the spinal column level of entry. In other words, where that peripheral nerve enters the spinal cord, that's where it decussates and crosses over to the opposite side of the body. Our second category of ascending or sensory tracts are Spinocerebellar Tracts, meaning that they originate in the spinal cord and then they terminate in the cerebellum. And generally, these are considered to be the primary pathway for transmitting proprioceptive information. In other words, proprioceptive information from the arms, the neck, the trunk, legs, all of that information gets sent via the spinocerebellar tracts to the sensory cortex, or primary sensory cortex. Sometimes it's referred to it as that. These are monosynaptic in the sense that there's only one synapse going from the sensory neuron to the termination site. We have two kinds of spinocerebellar tracts. We have the posterior and the anterior, and the posterior is ipsilateral, meaning it doesn't decussate, but the anterior spinocerebellar tract does decussate. It is contralateral. So here is an example of how you might view some of the ascending tracts. So we have the lateral spinothalamic tract. Again, there's two, lateral and anterior, primarily transmitting pain and temperature information. Again, we're going from the bottom up. And then we have some areas where decussation is happening, which is what the blue arrows are pointing at. So remember that decussation for the spinothalamic tract occurs at the level of entry in the spinal cord or spinal column, and you can see that. Pain receptors crossing over, temperature receptors crossing over. Our other spinocerebral tract, the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, which is here just shown as medial lemniscal tract, you can see decussates at the level of the medulla, which is what the blue arrow is pointing at. And then our spinocerebellar tract is shown here as well, which is ipsilateral. It does not decussate at any level. If we're referring to the posterior spinocerebellar tract, I should be specific about that because the anterior does decussate. We just were looking at the ascending or sensory tracts, and now we have the descending or motor tracts. These are the tracts that are, again, collections of axons, and they originate in the higher order centers and terminate in the spinal cord. The first category of motor neural pathways or descending tracts are the pyramidal or corticospinal tracts. Corticospinal is referring to origin and termination. So cortico is referring to the cerebral cortex, and then termination in the spine. What's interesting about the corticospinal or pyramidal tracts is that most, meaning that roughly about 60% of the cell bodies are located in the motor cortex. They are monosynaptic, and they are also contralateral. They decussate at the level of the pyramids in the medulla. You might be interested in why these are referred to as the pyramidal tracts. This tract's name results from the pyramid shape of the tract's collection of nerve fibers as it travels from the cortex to the spinal cord. The pyramidal tracts control fine motor skill performance, and you can see here that there are two types of pyramidal tracts. We have the anterior corticospinal tract in red, which, as you can see, decussates at the level of entry to the spinal cord. I should say the level of exit of the spinal cord. And then we also have the lateral corticospinal tract, which is in the pink color, and that does decussate at the level of the medulla. The second type of descending or motor pathway, motor tracks, we have our extrapyramidal tracks, also referred to as the brainstem pathways, because the cell bodies are in the brainstem with axons descending into the spinal cord. They're referred to as extrapyramidal because they operate outside of the pyramids of the medulla. We have two principal pathways, the rubrospinal and the reticulospinal tracts. Most of these are ipsilateral, except for, of course, the one that's shown in the next image, which is the rubrospinal tract. So here you can see the rubrospinal tract is definitely not ipsilateral, it is contralateral, but there are 4 tracts within the extrapyramidal tracts, and most are ipsilateral. And the extrapyramidal tracts control posture involuntarily, as well as hand and finger flexion and extension.